Found it, yeah. So, Barry Coates, as we understand it, the Pacific countries already have a trade agreement with Australia and New Zealand called Spartica, which gives them duty-free access to Australian and New Zealand markets. Why then are Pacific countries negotiating PACER, and what might they want out of a new agreement?
So the first reason that they're negotiating is because they have been told they have to. And Australia and New Zealand have said that Spartica is kind of a what they call a non-reciprocal agreement. So basically New Zealand and Australia offer more than they get in return. So it's not entirely reciprocal. And that's a style of trade agreement which somewhat paradoxically is not in accordance with the way the WTO likes to do things. The World Trade Organization likes to do things. So the first reason to have the negotiations is to convert it into an agreement where the Pacific Islands are forced to open up their economy in the same way that Australia and New Zealand open up to Pacific export.
Right.
That's the first reason. We've done a report as Oxfam to say that actually you don't have to do that under World Trade Organization rules. It's quite okay to have a non-reciprocal agreement, and that's in fact in the Pacific's best interest, because then they can give priority to things that are in the development interest of the Pacific. The second, there are other reasons that Pacific countries are citing that such an agreement could be useful. One of the reasons is to get labour mobility for people wanting to travel from the islands to New Zealand kind of locked in. Because at the moment it happens, you have horticultural workers here, for example, under what's called the Recognised Employer Scheme. So you get around 5,000 workers coming from the Pacific each year to work in horticulture in Hawke's Bay and Bay of Plenty and so on.
Yeah.
And it's great for the employers, they love it, and it's great for the workers. And the idea is that a trade agreement might lock those numbers in so that New Zealand and Australia would commit to a certain number of people in future. It's probably slightly a vain hope because Australia and New Zealand won't do that in the face of potential recession and unemployment in our country, and it's fine to do these things when there's when there's relatively full employment. They're less keen to do it when there is unemployment, and there are a few other reasons to do that, but those are the main ones.
Okay, so I guess from there, what are the potential risks or dangers of negotiating a new trade agreement with Australia and New Zealand?
The risks are that you would kind of prematurely open up the economies of the Pacific Islands to additional imports. They're already kind of importing a lot of stuff and exporting very little. So, they're not closed off to imports by any means. In fact, these are some of the most open economies in the world in terms of that trade represents a large part of their national income. And they're relatively small, so they can't produce a whole lot of things. But it would force them to open up much more, and furthermore, would force them to lock their tariffs at zero or a very low rate. And if you look at the history of how countries have developed in the past, whether you look at today's rich countries, the OECD countries or the major developing countries in Asia, all of them have used a kind of margin of protection to help stimulate their local business, to get them going, to get them producing, to start a base of the local economy. And then when they've been internationally competitive, they've then reduced the tariffs and opened up trade. And that's allowed them to compete without just having local industry wiped out. So doing that too early means that the Pacific businesses that do exist would be wiped out in an early stage.
Right. So
there are other reasons to fear an opening up of the process, including the ability of Pacific governments to regulate investments. There have been fly-by-night investments in the Pacific who rip off and exploit resources and basically don't do what they say they're going to do in terms of Pacific development. So being able to regulate investors is important, and that can be undermined in trade negotiations.
Right. So you see a strong argument for some sort of import substitution for a time, so the Pacific can eventually compete with bigger markets such as Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, already the Pacific imports from New Zealand, for example, around $1 billion a year, and exports to us about 170 million. Of non-oil products. So, there is a major trade deficit, and some of that is recovered with tourism receipts, but still there's a huge deficit. And the challenge is actually helping the Pacific export more, not helping the Pacific import more.
Mm. Right. So what chance do the Pacific countries have of getting a good outcome from PACER negotiations, and can they maximize the benefits and minimize the risks to any extent?
If you're going for one of the standard free trade agreements, which is compatible with the World Trade Organization, it's very restrictive, and there's very little wriggle room for what countries can do in order to promote their development. What we're calling for is a new style of agreement, a non-reciprocal agreement, which you can do, and that would start off with what's good for the Pacific's development at its core, and then basically say, how can we build this then into more of an economic cooperation agreement rather than a free trade agreement? And from the Pacific's perspective, that makes all the sense in the world, because the difficulty is in producing and exporting things. And there are lots of things that New Zealand could be doing in order to support that. For example, the way many countries develop is that they take raw materials, they kind of assemble them or they change them, and then they export them again. Mm. But the rules of origin that govern that kind of process make it really difficult for Pacific countries to do that. And New Zealand has offered better rules of origin to other countries like Australia and Thailand and many Asian countries than we've offered to our Pacific neighbours. So one of the first things we're saying is you don't need a trade agreement in order to give the Pacific fair terms of trade and fair rules on trade. So why don't you work first on those issues, not to use these things as a bargaining chip in a trade negotiation, but actually because you care about the development of the Pacific and it's good for New Zealand to have a healthy and prosperous Pacific community on our doorstep.
So in that way, would you see Spartaca Plus, some sort of model like that, as more appropriate before heading straight into a full-on free trade agreement such as PACER Plus?
Well, we have doubts as to whether a full-on PACER Plus kind of free trade agreement would ever be particularly beneficial for the Pacific. Yeah. So if you look at the moment, there are a limited number of Pacific countries that are actually members of the World Trade Organization. So to get the whole lot of them to sign up to a World Trade Organization compatible deal means that small island nations are bearing a huge burden of administrative and bureaucratic costs for no other reason than to comply with rules of the World Trade Organization, which are actually designed for big and rich countries. So, the nice thing about it is partly as a result of our lobbying and partly because there's been a change of heart. The New Zealand government, for the first time, is starting to talk about a different model of trade agreement than the traditional free trade agreement. So what they're talking about in negotiations is the willingness to consider alternatives. And I think this is where public pressure can actually be really helpful. We can write to the government and say, even if Australia isn't particularly keen on this, New Zealand ought to be talking about this with our Pacific neighbours as a way to put development in the Pacific first. And that should be our interest rather than any kind of ideological position about trade liberalisation. The other thing that's really important is to do the things that would help the Pacific now. And one of the crucial things that's happening over the next few months is that the Pacific needs support for an independent trade negotiator who can represent their interests without coming under the influence of Australia and New Zealand. So there needs to be some funding for an independent post of a trade negotiator to be located. We've already got an office and a person filling the post, just that their funding runs out soon. So Australia and New Zealand ought to be putting some money into that and doing it without any strings attached and any conditions attached. So again, people can write to the government, let them know that this is important, and they ought to be funding this post of the Office of Chief Trade Advisor. There's material on Oxfam's website on these issues.
Great. So you seem to point out that overall economic liberalisation under trade agreements is not the answer to all economic development problems. So can you pinpoint 3 things other than trade agreements, such as PACER Plus, that would help Pacific development?
Enabling and supporting Pacific people to access proper education and training.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's kind of, in many Pacific countries, there is a minority of students who can afford to go on to secondary school. And, you know, if you're looking at training young people for the modern world economy, and they leave school after primary school with primary school qualifications, they don't really have much chance of competing in today's global economy. So, you know, education and training is something that New Zealand does support, but we ought to do a whole lot more. And, you know, our aid budget as a country is very low by international standards. We're not at all a generous aid giver. So that's one thing. Secondly, we ought to be taking action on early things we can do on trade with regard to things like improving rules of origin, improving biosecurity arrangements whereby Pacific products often can't enter New Zealand, not because they're fundamentally dangerous to the New Zealand environment, but because of the onerous rules and rather unnecessary regulations that are sometimes imposed on developing countries. And I think the third thing that we could do is ensure that we provide assistance to these countries to be able to build their economic base so that they can export. And for us, that means building the rural economy. You know, most of the Pacific's people live in the rural areas. Many of them live a semi-subsistence lifestyle. They don't need help with kind of big private sector grants for companies. They need help in terms of basic rural infrastructure and transport and education and training and capacity building, helping people to understand the basics about business and be able to improve their production, to be able to market their products. And there are already some great success stories. Looking at organics, at fair trade, you know, the ways that companies are able to transcend that kind of lack of cost competitiveness from the Pacific and be able to export into niche markets. So let's build on those good examples rather than sort of talking about giving lots of money to companies. This is often talked about with regard to our aid program.
Cool, great. So thank you very much for your time today, Barry. We really appreciate it, and all the best. Are there any more kind of Oxfam reports coming up on PACER Plus in the near future for us to watch out for?
We'll put some stuff on about this Office of Chief Trade Advisor up on the website in the next week or so.
Oh, great.
The key thing we've got coming out on June the 1st is a big new campaign. It's on food and agriculture, including in the Pacific. Fabulous campaign. It's what we call an intelligent look at hunger, and it's a campaign that actually tries to deal with the real reasons that there are over a billion people in the world who haven't got enough to eat. For agricultural land and water supplies. So, and it's about climate change.
Oh, we seem to be having trouble with the connection, so might just end it there.